Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you're well. My name is Alex, and this is Slumber Time Podcast. Today, we're going to be doing something a little different. Instead of reading different pieces from different authors as we usually do, I thought we could interview one. I've mentioned him many times on this podcast, and I even read his poem Solitude in the first episode. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome one of my best mates, PJ Burke-Trapp, to today's podcast. How you doing, PJ?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Doing fine, even though we recorded a bit and somehow lost it all. Cool.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Glad to have you here. So I'm
Yeah.
going to ask the question again so people listening to the podcast know what we're talking about. I'd like to
Yeah.
ask you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, your works, your background, things you write, and themes you often use, that kind of thing.
All right. Well, I write in different formats. I mean, I write plays, poems, I write prose, I also write music. And for me, it's all basically the same thing. I try to express the same themes. I talk, I used to write a lot about my own feelings and what I felt and what I had to kind of work through. And I think that's changed recently in the sense that I'm trying to go beyond that and trying to kind of listen to other voices. So, like, especially uh, those that are kind of unprivileged, those are that don't have much of a voice.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to get in the character of these people rather than talking about myself.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
would you classify yourself kind of like how world music is kind of a amalgamation of all different types of music? Would you say that's kind of like the type of writing you do? World writing?
That, well, yeah, I would say so because I grew up on an island. I grew up on Gran Canaria. It's in the Canary Islands. Belongs to Spain, but it's closer to Morocco. And I grew up in a very cosmopolitan environment. My mum is German, my dad's Irish, and I feel that I've always been part of a world and not part of a particular country. And I've always been fascinated about culture from other countries. I'm constantly reading books by other authors, not just authors from the countries I know, or not just musicians from the countries I know, filmmakers. So I think culture is very rich if you go beyond the country you know. There's so much more out there.
Oh, I completely understand that. Who are you reading recently?
I've gone all American. I'm reading Catch 22 at the moment.
Oh,
Uh, it's a great book. I'm loving it. I think people find it very difficult, and it's been described as the only true war novel by another writer. And I think it is in the sense of it's very absurd and insane. There's nothing heroic about the characters. All just absurd. It's borderline dada. I love the dialogues. It's a great book. Recommend it.
nice. So, you seem to have a lot of experience with writing and classical works. Like, what got you interested in all that?
What got me interested in the classics?
Well, not just the classics, but I would just say the humanities in general.
All right. Well, my dad's family, they come from the theater, and I mainly lived with my mum actually, but I always went to see my dad every summer, every winter, and the family, and I just remembered all those costumes, all those, everyone just reciting Shakespeare the whole time, or Yeats, and I think that probably got me into it. They're all bohemian, so I couldn't help um, but kind of become a bohemian myself. I would have been a rebel if I just would have been a non-bohemian person. So I think that got me into humanities, I suppose. Just all the books my dad had as well, and all the CDs, and I just enjoyed everything I could get my hands on.
You've also mentioned a bit of a love for your grandfather, who was also really into that, right?
Yes, he was my Irish grandfather. Yeah, he was also an actor, obviously, and he always was reciting constantly just songs, unknown songs, known songs. He seemed to have a great memory for songs in particular, for poetry. And he was just a great performer while also being a very humane person. And I love the combo of being so artistic but not judging someone either for not being able to quote Julius Caesar. Like, so I love that kind of, yeah, I just love that personality he had. Yeah.
Yet you studied philosophy.
Um, I, I did I did study philosophy and film studies in
Nothing wrong with
Belfast
that.
in Northern Ireland. And nothing wrong with that. It didn't
Absolutely
really.
not.
No, I mean, it did give me a teaching job indirectly because I
Ah.
needed a qualification. Otherwise, I haven't used the degree since. But look, there you go. That's just I'll stick to it. Look, I watched two movies a day at that time, and I did analyze them a lot. So I mean, I was sort of, you know, engaged with both subjects.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm I'm taking the Mickey out of you. How about that one?
Yeah, go ahead. You can take the
Using
mickey
the
as much
English
as you want.
slang. Or not slang,
Oh,
whatever it is.
oh, very European.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah, yeah. So I got to ask then. I'm going just over the basic questions at this point. Then we'll get into the really interesting ones. Like, for
Go
example,
ahead.
like what author or poet has had the biggest impact on your style? Do you think?
That's a great question. This might sound cliche, but I would say my dad was the
Okay,
biggest influence.
okay. I
Um,
feel like cliche would be Shakespeare.
well, you see, I didn't get to a lot of the big classics until a much latter age. So really, I had a very sort of mixed. I was reading a lot of Somerset Maugham and Irish Murder when I was a teenager, not Shakespeare. I got into Shakespeare later and Dickens a lot later. But you see, I had my dad's CDs since I was a kid,
Hmm.
and didn't really have that many CDs and didn't really have that many books. So I was listening to him ever since I was a kid. And as a teenager, I actually kind of started understanding his lyrics and what he was talking about. And then I started reading his stuff, his poetry, his plays as well. But it was his music and then his writing that influenced me first of all, and then came a lot of other artists as well.
If you had to place him into one or two different genres, what would you say he's like?
That's a good one. Let me think
I,
about that
I
a
unfortunately
second.
haven't listened to much from him, so I actually don't know much either.
Well, in his, well, you see, he's very much a blues musician. So he was very much influenced by the blues, and I would say
Hmm.
that the blues influenced me primarily after listening to him because he always played the blues. So I started listening to the old blues musicians. I would say he is a blues musician, but there's a lot of rock in there and a lot of jazz in his music and a lot of classical techniques because both his mother and his grandmother were opera singers.
Wow.
And all this music reflects, I find, in his fiction, I find as well. So a lot of his plays deal with music or even the themes that blues talks about. So so interesting. So the music is very much correlated to his fiction and to his stories.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that does tell us a bit more about you, I think, in that way. So that's
Oh yeah,
basically like where you started. But
yeah.
right now, where do you get most of your inspiration in your writing?
Right. Well, that's a good question. So I feel like in my 20s I was reading a lot. After I had studied university, I seem to have just ended up reading constantly, nonstop, for at least a few years. And right now, I've really slowed down, to be honest. I've been just writing nonstop since I've been in isolation, and so I've just been writing. I haven't actually been reading much, strangely enough. I would have thought I'd be reading more. And to be honest, now I don't get so many influences in the arts. It's literally what I see outside my balcony, who I talk to by phone, the mountains around me, the sea. It's become very organic, a um, very direct kind of influence, I feel.
If you ask me, that's the best place to find your writing. It's nothing you can force.
It,
It's got to be from the heart or just come organically.
exactly. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's all become very minimal now with isolation. That's the one good thing about it, that we can all spend some time to reflect and to go inside or to even just look outside and just take it all, just appreciate a bit more whatever you have.
So you've been writing more positive types of pieces recently?
Um, a mixture, I think. Sometimes positive because I feel that we need positivity now more than ever, and
Mm.
sometimes I succumb to the terrible things that are happening outside politically. Not so much even not so much even COVID. I feel like there's a lot more severe stuff happening that's caused by humans, politicians. So I have some writing regarding that as well, some angry stuff, and then I have some stuff where I really try to make it positive, and the positive stuff is more for other people to try to encourage them.
Yeah,
Whereas yeah, I would say the angry stuff is a bit more me trying to deal with the situation.
I think you can also turn it in a way that's going to inspire others to
Yeah.
kind of be. I'm imagining more like Malcolm X in a way. Like he
Mm.
was very, what's the word? I don't want to say angry, but he inspired others because of the frustrations that society put in his way.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of artists do that. They're angry, they're frustrated, like and a lot of repressed artists, especially, they try to make something positive out of it. They try to find a solution for them and for others. And I think that's great and true art. If you're able to do both, reflect upon the times, deal with it, and then try to find a solution.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
I, that's exactly what I'm thinking about for the next podcast, which I'm going to keep quiet here for now. But
Okay. Okay. Looking forward to it.
yeah, oh man, I'll just say here, I've put about 10 hours into it already, and I
Okay.
imagine another 10.
Okay. Well, look, I'll listen to it. It better be good.
Oh,
That's it.
I think it will be. I'm really, really excited for it. So yeah, you mentioned that yeah, because of quarantine and all that, you've been doing a lot more writing. So I have to ask then, what would you do if you just had to stop writing?
Well, I would revert to music, but I suppose the question would then be, what would I do if I can't do music either? If I can't express myself artistically?
Yeah, yeah. Let's make it that.
Hmm.
Let's say that.
Well, that would be really difficult for me, to be honest. I think I would get depressed, honestly. And it's the same with my dad. I know because I've been talking with him about it as well, that we're all stuck in now. It's bad for him. He's a musician, so
Mm,
he really cannot work right now properly. I think all you can do now is to express yourself if you're an artist. And if I can't do that, I would probably spend more time outdoors, which I do actually anyway as much as I can because I live in a very small village close to the mountains, so I am able to go out a bit. And if I couldn't express myself, I'll probably just be going out all the time, becoming a bit of a jungle boy kind of. I'll
living
be
under
I
bridges, as you're known for. He really is known
oh
for
yeah.
that.
Yes, I was doing that a lot in my travels as well. That's because I grew up on an island, so I like that. Actually, I think I would start jogging a lot more. I've done that once or twice in my
All right.
life where I was not able to express myself, and I would jog a lot. Jogging, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah, this is the only interview question that I imagined actually having a correct answer. And an artist without art is nothing, is how I
It's
imagine it.
difficult, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
it's
imagine
just
like
difficult.
an artist would die if they couldn't express themselves.
I think it's very difficult. There is a great
Hmm.
novel by Paul Auster, actually, about that. I think it's called Moonlight Palace. And there is a passage in it, I won't tell too much, but there's a passage in it where an artist is stuck in the middle of the desert. He happens to have a limited amount of paint, and he just paints because he cannot leave this particular place. And as soon as he runs out of paint, he starts just writing because he's got still got some pencils, and and the story goes on like that. And I feel like an artist would just find another way of expressing himself somehow, even if there's no medium left. He'll find something. Maybe he'll start humming to himself and or try tap dancing under a table or something. Some kind of form of expression.
Makes sense. Creators internally want to create, right? They
Yeah, I
can't
think so.
stop creating if they're a true creator. So, yeah, it's quite reminiscent of that, I feel.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely. Yeah. I think it's a very good thing to do because the act of creating is usually a good thing, and that's the point about. I think art should be, in some sense, a moral obligation. So if you're going to create something, you should definitely try to make a positive thing. It can be a dark uh, subject matter, as we just mentioned. I think if we start using art to hurt others, which has been done,
Mm,
it does exist, but that's not true art. That's not that book that makes you just feel bad is not a good book, in my opinion. It's
fair
all in
enough.
good. Yeah,
Uh,
it can be dark, but it has to sort of help you somehow, teach you something at least.
I have a question about that in just a second, actually. But
Okay, yeah.
what I want to say is, you reminded me of a quote from Rent. The opposite of war
Okay.
isn't peace; it's creation. And yeah,
That's a good one.
it's a musical that
All right.
a lot of people may not like, but a lot of people also love. Either way, let me just get into that question I was going to ask, which is
Okay.
what makes a good story to you?
That's a difficult one. Ultimately, I think art is entertainment. Ultimately, it can teach you. But it can teach you. It can bring goods. It can bring goodness in you. But the bring goodness in you is ultimately a type of entertainment. So I'm
Hmm.
not talking about Brave New World kind of distraction entertainment. I'm talking about just something that brings some positivity. And it's the same with story. A good story, I feel, doesn't have to be written in a particular way, or the grammar doesn't have to be perfect, or the plot doesn't have to be extremely intricate. I think a good story is a story that draws you in. And I wouldn't say distracts you from the outside world, but it engages you somehow with the story. You begin to correlate with the story. And I feel like the classics are usually classics because they have done that to readers. This effect of bringing them to the story, bringing them inside.
Okay, just kind of a follow up on that. Like, what is your thoughts on
Yeah.
escapism?
Hmm. Saying that about entertainment, I'm not a fan of escapism
Hmm.
because that's going too far. That's taking. So one thing is to engage the reader with the story. One thing is to kidnap the reader and make him forget about real life. And to be honest, I do blame that's a bit more common on TV, but it's also, or in films, but it's also very much present in books. It's this effect of that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad quality. That can sometimes even mean it's fantastic quality in sort of a in the quality sense, not in the spiritual sense. What I mean is escapism is when you start neglecting real life, because
Mm-hmm.
in the end, there's no better novel or film than your actual life, which you should live, because in the end, that is reality. Art and or entertainment is should be there as help, should be there as a secondary
Mm.
option, because it's good to sort of switch off perhaps from reality. But escapism is good a bit, but as soon as it starts to take over your life, as soon as you start binge watching constantly, not that there's nothing wrong with binge watching for a week or something, if you just start binge watching for months and years, and you end up having no relationship with people, interpersonal relationships, that happens a lot, and that's where I find it becomes dangerous. Any communication medium, entertainment, or art, even.
Fair enough. Yeah. Since we are still in quarantine in some areas of the world, you can't really say not to binge watch for some of them, but
No, so as I said, yeah, I think it's good at certain times and for certain periods. But if it becomes a habit, then it starts. Just don't think most people are happy either binge watching all the time.
So it's
before I
not just
start
that
playing.
art imitates life, it's art betters life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
Hmm.
and I shouldn't replace life. I
No,
think.
no, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but some people forget that.
Which one would be the right word? Supplement or complement? I always mix the two up.
Yeah. It should complement
Complement, I
life. I
guess,
think
would
so.
be the correct word.
I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
Supplementary would
Exactly.
be
Yeah.
additional, so never mind.
I think you could say that though. You could say that. It's there to be side by side, but not to replace it. Um, there is a story that my dad tells me
Hmm.
often enough, and I think it's taken by a Zola novel. I think it's from Chef d'oeuvre, I think it's called, so the masterpiece. But I can't guarantee that. It's just this is his interpretation, his reinterpretation. So it's an artist who's a genius, and he paints, and yes, everyone loves his paintings. But he's a bit poor. He just begins paint. Well, he's still painting. He's poor though, but he has a lovely wife. She gets pregnant. He still paints. Great art. All's good. And then he starts his masterpiece, and he's got to keep on painting. But his wife is delivering, and right. So instead of bringing her to the hospital, he just keeps painting because he believes in art by then and not life. And I find that's the end of the tale, by the way. It's a bit morbid, sorry, but I find that's a good tale to remember that art really shouldn't um,
Replace
overbear
life. Yeah.
replace. Yeah,
No, that makes a lot
yeah.
of sense.
Well, my dad is full of. He's a very witty guy, and then he comes up with this moral fable, which is supposed to make me think. So he's quite a character, I'd say.
Well, yeah, he's doing basically what we've been saying through half this. It's just balance, right? So
Exactly. Yeah, it's
he
all
can
about
just be a
balance.
witty guy and then also a very wise father at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's why. I mean, that's why we both. Well, you live in Japan now, but I live in Japan too. I think that's what attracts us to Japanese culture, in a sense, or at least traditional culture. East Asian culture is this finding balance, this Buddhist notion of everything should be in balance. And I find that's very helpful for life in general, for people. Everything in balance,
I
nothing too much.
I completely agree, but I've gotten so tired of hearing that as my answer from my students.
I
We
can
should
imagine it.
we should do a balance of both. Like, well, why don't you actually
Oh
have an
yeah,
opinion?
well yeah, they're very fond of that notion there, so
Yes.
it can be a bit too much as well. Yeah,
There there's a balance to having too much balance.
that's true too. You see, that's not balanced then. You're just
Exactly,
balancing the whole
exactly.
time.
There's
So there you go.
for those listeners who don't know much about Japan, one critique many people have against the Japanese is that there's a lack of an opinion. They are group culture and they always focus on peace, which has worked wonderfully within their own culture, not so much with others from outside cultures, and creates a big culture shock for many people. So when you're trying to get an idea out of them, you're going to have some trouble at times getting them to just say yes or no because they
Hmm.
don't want to disagree with you.
That's true.
So, yeah, that's an example of having too much balance in an
Yeah.
unbalanced way.
Well, yeah, that becomes in its extreme form, it becomes a lack of initiative, a lack of
Mm.
decision making. You'd rather not decide. You'd just rather not be in conflict with someone, so you're going to stay neutral.
And I
So
think
that's in its
this
extreme format.
this can be seen in a lot of literature too. You get those cliches. You have, oh, this has worked in all these other pieces and not
Yeah,
adding something new, a new twist to it. And you see that all the time in movies these days. I'm not going to blame this completely, but it's definitely taken our focus off of that idea. And Aristotle goes a lot more into this in Poetics, but he ranks, I think it's the seven different parts of theater and performance, and spectacle is the lowest. But we have taken so much time focusing on spectacle in most of our movies with the
yeah,
creation of CGI, and yeah, that's why people say, "Oh, the good old days from the 70s or 80s." It's generally because like they were mostly focusing on story, whereas like the 90s were focusing mostly on CGI, and then from there they focused more on story since, but
yeah.
maybe at a lesser rate.
That's true.
But I'm not going to say
Yeah.
that like movies and such these days don't have amazing things happening. Like there's still some really good ones.
And I think the movie industry has, well, or Hollywood or the US movie industry, let's just say, has changed in the sense of the spectacle you get in a 2 hour format film. And that's why TV series, I think, are better, at
Mm.
least have been better the last 10 years, because they realize it's a different format. They realized they could work on plots and twists. It's very, very heavy on plot twists, a lot of these non comedic series nowadays. And basically you can just go on and on with it. And so I think if you're looking for less spectacle, more depth and plots, you could watch Breaking Bad or Mr. Robot or one of those series. And I think yeah, that's not just spectacle. So it's changed a bit. It has, yeah.
Yeah, they're able to grow character a bit more, and I completely agree. And it's another reason like I like stage shows generally more than like
Yeah.
movies. So not a great example, I guess, but Sweeney Todd. People don't like the movie version much just because of Johnny Depp, I guess, but and his singing. But the stage show just yeah, yeah, I'm not going to get into that. But the stage show just
Mm,
brings so much energy. Of course, you're also there with an audience, so that's part of it. But they can also focus a bit more on character. In I
mm,
think the play is like 3 hours compared to the 2 hour movie. So completely understand what you mean.
definitely.
So I think we have gone on a rant there, especially me.
No, no.
Now, I'd like to ask you, I think, two more questions before we
Go
finish
ahead.
up here. So, one of the most interesting ones, I think, is what have you learned from writing, from you yourself writing? What have you learned about the world and about yourself, if anything comes to mind?
Let me think about this for a second.
Please. I'll cut out any dead
Right.
air.
Yeah. So I think out of writing, and writing is constant task. You're constantly just writing and writing and improving yourself. And I think you just learn to see life and the world a bit more with understanding. I think you grow empathy.
Mm,
Depends on what kind of writing you do, but I think most generally you grow empathy perhaps because you're writing from people's perspectives. So you're usually not going to be writing from your own perspective. It's not 100% autobiographical usually. And so you're writing about other people, you're writing about this fictional person, and you grow to care for this fictional person. So having empathy for a character that doesn't exist is a good exercise for having empathy for people you don't know,
mm.
because neither of them you know physically. And I think that's what we need anyway nowadays. So I recommend everyone to write. That's particularly in prose. Now, when writing poems, I think it's similar as well sometimes, but poetry is always a lot more introspective. But I think you also begin to understand the world and the sounds of the world when you start to write poetry. So you hear that everything has a sound, everything has character, there is a beauty or a message in everything when you begin to write poetry and start writing about these things that you observe or the people you interact with.
Hmm. And also listening to those types of things, you can hear a bit of a rhythm in them too, the kind of meter you're going for
Yeah,
in that
exactly.
poetry.
Yeah. So yeah, basically so I think like poetry is one step before music. There's the music; it's already creeping in between the syllables in poetry. So I really like that. But then you got theater as well, which is kind of it's really the mix with theater. I find there's everything there. So I feel like it's all a growth and it's all like an aim of understanding. You begin to understand others better when writing, I feel.
I feel like it kind of branches off in a way. You have like your just normal novels, but for branching off that like a spider web, you have theater on one thread of that, which is just all dialogue. That's what I want to say.
Mm, dialogue, right?
So yeah, theater has it is just dialogue in most cases, whereas
Mm,
in poetry you're mostly explaining. So it's kind of at the other end of that spectrum.
mm,
You have
very much so, yeah.
just explaining the scene, there, books in the middle, and then theater on the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Interesting about theater, I find, is that you do have to bring that inner dialogue or inner monologue, whatever is going on, that's not whatever is going on in a story that's not explained through people talking. You have to kind of express in the theater by the mise en scène or
Oh yeah.
maybe the way that people express themselves, the lighting, and it's the same in it's the same in film, except that film is a bit more, what's the word? It's a bit more cheeky in the sense that they can use music editing afterwards. It's like they do it in the studio, but in stage you actually have to do it right on the spot. And I find that's an extra something that you can only get if you see in the theater.
But a lovely thing what
It's
my
quite
professor
crazy.
pointed out to me about it is it's never the same any other time you
Mm,
see it.
yeah, I mean, we've seen some great theater in Tokyo.
Oh yeah.
And those were also some great binding experience. I feel like, it's a great memory for us. We didn't just watch the film on the computer. And we did see a story of a staircase, for example, was only played 3 times, I think. And
Yeah.
that's it.
Entirely in Japanese there. It's a Spanish play done in Japanese, and it was absolutely amazing. I recommend anyone check out Story of a Staircase in any language that you can get it in.
Yeah.
And the other one was One Green Bottle by Hideki
Ah,
Noda.
yes, that's right. Hmm.
And that's another one I recommend if anyone's looking for some really interesting plays to find. The book we got,
Yeah.
it's half Japanese, half English, so you can always
Oh,
compare and see what he really meant. So yeah, subtext is much easier to read into in that.
yeah. No, both great plays. And it's particularly about story of a staircase.
Hmm.
It is a Spanish play, and like I only read it before. I did read it before, so I knew the story, but I found that it was my limited Japanese and was my hazy memory of the play because I hadn't read it for a few years. I could understand everything, and the actors, particularly I think Fernando, so the one of the main
Mm.
protagonists, he just was Spanish for me. There was nothing. He was a Japanese guy talking in Japanese, but it was so Spanish. It was so of that era, which was I think it was the 30s to the 60s. So mainly Franco Spain. It's a very particular kind of temperament people had in that time, especially the men. And that these students conveyed it. They were in their 20s. I find that amazing, and that's what I want to say about culture. Is there's so much to it. In this theater for a few days in Tokyo back then, 2017, we saw true beauty, true art,
Mm.
and it was a unique experience.
And when a play is done successfully, it is one of the best feelings.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
Luckily, we didn't see any failures, so
exactly. Yeah, so we were lucky. Probably there were a lot around us, but we were just lucky. Yeah,
yeah. Oh yeah, 2 out of however many are done a year.
exactly. Yeah.
So you said a little bit ago that you advise anybody to write. So I have to ask, do you have any advice to those wanting to be writers?
Yeah, I would suggest that. I think that, especially at the beginning and still constantly, and I think I hear this from a lot of other authors. Two advices actually. First of all, write when you feel like writing. If nothing comes for months, there are two things to do. Either you just begin writing, and it's probably nonsense what comes out, but the act of writing can also be an exercise. But what don't feel like you have to write if you really just don't feel like it. You really can't write right now. So it will come to you. So the input is also important. So just giving yourself a break and just receiving, even if you're just alone in a house, you're receiving information the whole time, which can then be processed later. Either leave it or just start writing something down as an exercise. Like the Japanese author Banana Yoshimoto, she writes 1 hour a day, for example, and that's it. And she's quite well renowned. Or Haruki Murakami, he writes about 8 hours a day. The point is that there's no particular rule for writing. Just write when you feel like writing, when you have that impulse, or when you can.
Hmm?
My second advice is that even if no one encourages you, even if no one likes what you're writing, and the critics say it's crap, Well, are you satisfied? Are you happy with what you've done? And if you can say yes, or you can say, pretty happy, I think I can work on this, but I'm going to keep on trying, well, then you've done a good job, I feel.
Definitely.
So don't put yourself down. Yeah,
Yeah, kind of jumping off that, find an editor or find someone just to send it to. Like you
exactly.
you know this PJ already that I'll send you something I'm working on and you're like, "Oh, this is really nice." Or yeah, I
Yeah,
think that the last part's a bit wordy, for example, and
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Eh,
showing it to people, getting ideas.
Yeah, you have to be open to critique, definitely. But I feel like as a critique, you should be also looking at what's good about it as well. There are a lot of critiques there,
Oh yeah.
critics that are very severe. And I think, to be honest though, my harshest critic is myself, actually.
Mm.
I'm very harsh to myself. I'm constantly editing stuff. Two things about that. First of all, don't forget to remind yourself that you did finish something. Don't feel too bad about it. Careful with over editing too. You don't want to necessarily over edit something, over polish something. Sometimes a certain roughness from those early poems or stories is also good.
Oh,
Yeah,
definitely. Kind of
yeah.
something that you were saying gave me an idea. You were talking about sort of like writer's block, like if you can't think of anything. Some advice that I was thinking for it would be just try another form. So if you want to write
Mm,
poetry, don't do poetry today. Go and try a
yeah,
short story or try a play or prose, something new, and then that might get juices flowing, and you might have something really amazing that's just in another form out there.
exactly. Yeah. So I mean, that's what you can do. Talking about editing,
Hmm.
this might seem a bit ironic actually, because Alice Munro, the short story writer in Canada, she has actually rewritten a lot of her stories, sometimes changing the title. I think sometimes she just calls it version two. That's very unusual with short stories. So there's also that she does kind of what I what I just advised not to do. So she does actually go back to her old stories, edits them again, sometimes even changes the name. And a lot of musicians do this as well, where they're not happy with a song they recorded 10 years ago. So my dad has a few songs, several songs, that there are at least a few versions. Sometimes going back to your writing and reading it and then editing it a bit or seeing what is good about that part is also good. So be yourself editor, but learn how to be a good editor. Don't be a severe, unnecessary editor. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, you can definitely learn from other books, just reading other things to see like
Mm,
the way theirs look in other ways. Obviously, don't steal from them whatsoever, but it could
yeah, definitely.
inspire like, oh, this might not work in this way. But yeah, Walt Whitman was another one who was like that with Leaves of Grass. I don't think he ever really found a finished version that he liked.
Ah, so that happens too, yeah, of course.
Oh yeah. All
And
right.
I mean,
Mm,
and I just wanted to add that
please.
some novels are just perfectly edited. And some of my favorite novels are the opposites. I mean, if you read James Joyce's Ulysses, for example, it's just because the stream of consciousness as well, there's nothing. I mean, either that book should have been edited down completely, or just as soon as you finish writing it, there's nothing to edit. Sometimes certain books are, especially children's books, should be neatly edited, I find,
Oh
and they
yeah.
look better.
They have to
And
be
sometimes
cut
it's just
down and. Mm.
exactly, yeah. And sometimes it's just a stream of consciousness, kind of. Even Murakami, even though it's not as experimental, Haruki Murakami, they're long books, and sometimes the plot doesn't. Maybe sometimes it's not just all about the plot advancing. Sometimes it's taking a step back. So that could be nice too. So I mean, there's really everything in art you can do. No, yeah, There are a lot of options. So that's what I love about art.
Yeah, sky's the limit. Well, not even that in
Exactly.
most cases. You could also write about
Not
space, I
even that.
guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, all right.
Um,
So, last question here for you.
yeah.
Where can we find you? All right, where can we find some of your works, things like that? YouTube, Facebook, wherever.
You can find me at Kant Stream. So I've got this. So I started two podcasts recently enough. Well, thanks to you, Alex. You helped me a lot actually with getting it started. So this is me marketing myself. You can find me in Kant which includes poetry by others as well,
Mm.
and some music by others, but it's mainly my own poetry, and most of it is my music. And there are a lot of links there also as well, uh, that will give you more information. And that's Can Stream. I also have Feel Good Hit of the Summer, which is a very non-serious, purely musical podcast, but it's still part of my art because I feel like I'm working on comedy in the parts that I speak. It's more of a kind of an acting comedy, borderline dada podcast. And I'm also hoping to release very soon both a children's book of mine called Okutama Express. So if you're interested in it, I can give you a rough draft, offer you a rough draft. And I'm also trying to release, it's unsure when, two plays of mine. One about my Irish grandfather called The Actor, and one that's quite different in tone, perhaps a bit political as well, called The Mountain of the World, was set in China in the 90s. And one-child policy is a big theme in it. So, yeah,
All
if you're
right.
interested, yeah, check my upcoming website.
Once that is set up, I'll go ahead and put that link in the YouTube description, but I will definitely be linking Kant Stream and Feel Good Hit of the Summer immediately.
Okay.
We'll see where we can fit Okutama Express in there. I know we can. We'll just find where it's going to be posted.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure.
Uh,
Really enjoyed this.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and sign us off. So,
Okay.
yeah, if you. So that means you shut up.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll say then, well, then goodbye and talk to you soon. And thanks for having me on again. Really appreciate it.
No problem, man. No problem. All right. If you enjoyed this, guys, let me know. If you have any recommendations for future poems, short stories, etc., please let me know. If you're on YouTube, like, subscribe, drop a comment with any thoughts or recommendations, and just remember, we're here and we're listening.